It's my very great pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Pat Thomson from the University of Nottingham, who is also the convener of the Centre for Research in Arts, Creativity and Literacy. Pat, I'm not going to read your many contributions now because I don't want to waste your time. We're here to hear you, but I do want to say how very excited we are to have you tonight. Your work in creativity and the arts and social justice and the need for authentic reform in education is well known to all of us. I also just want to add a little personal thing. I remember way back when you were doing your doctorate at the University of South Australia, one of the things that I was so impressed with at the time was the work you did around student voice, and especially student voice in research and the ethics of working with young people. So, I know that's a long time ago, but it's still very, very much valued. So I'm going to curate the Q&A after Pat's presentation. So if you'd like to put your questions in the chat room, I'll try and curate them. But now let's hand over to you, Pat.
Well, thank you very much, Robin and Michael, for inviting me to present this evening, and also to Thomas for all the organisation that he's done behind the scenes. So what I wanted to do this morning in my allotted time was to have a very quick gallop through two things. Firstly, the kind of general situation as I understand it in England. I have been here now for about 18 years, so I think it's a long time. I didn't intend to stay this long. And then bridge through the Durham Commission on Creativity and into a quick romp through the last major piece of research that I did with my colleague Chris Hall, and then foreshadow where that's actually going next. So let me start by perhaps situating my own research with Chris in the context of England. And what I want to argue, I think, or just sort of establish, and I'm not going to read out all these slides because I know they're a bit busy, but I also know that this is being recorded, and so that if you want to come back and have a look at any of this, you can also, just pause it and have a look at some of the detail on the slides. But what I want to argue, I think, is that there is a kind of UK, although actually primarily from England, tradition of research on arts and creativity, which is distinctive, I think. It's different from what happens in Australia, it's different from the US, it's different from Taiwan. And probably one marker that we could make is the NACI report, which I think established a kind of definition of creativity as being something novel and something new and something of value. And I think it's that's one strand, I think, of the research in the UK. But there's been, in England in particular, there's a lot of things that have been established. Some things were established, like creative partnerships, which have now gone. But there is a long-standing tradition, I think, now of artists working with schools, arts organisations working in partnerships with schools, of schools pinning their literally pinning a kite mark onto themselves, saying we do a lot of arts education. There's a kind of infrastructure that's available of vocational awards, of organisationals, what are called bridge organisations that support youth arts and work in schools, and cultural education partnerships, which are citywide kind of partnerships, education infrastructure through music. And if you're a funded arts organisation in England, Arts Council England, if you're a national priority organisation, who the organisations that get the big bucks, you have to actually have an education component to your program in order to get NPO funding. So there's this kind of infrastructure which is solid. And I think at the same time, there is this tradition of research which accompanies it. There's a lot of evaluation, of course, but there's also bigger research. And I think we're all familiar with the late Ken Robinson's work, and also probably the late Anna Craft's work, attempting to, I guess, differentiate between the kind of everyday invention and what if kind of thinking that people do, from the very big sort of, you know, people that we all go, wow, I could never do that. And also, of course, the work of Guy Claxton and Bill Lucas in looking at assessing creativities, which has been taken up by the OECD and turned into a kind of international testing program. There are a lot of people working in creativities and arts research. I've started to list them and then just ran out of space, but you'll see a lot of work, I think, around various aspects of particularly the arts, but also creativity more generally, in academic journals and at conferences. So I think in a way, this would suggest that, you know, things are going well for the arts and creativity in England. However, that's not the case, I'm afraid, particularly if we look in schooling. There's a lot of research now emerging about how classed, race and gendered the creative industries are. There's no easy pipeline, as policymakers suggest, from schools to the creative industries, and enrolments in arts subjects and arts teacher numbers are falling. They sort of stabilised this year, but design and technology are still falling. I think Andrew would probably agree that, you know, there are a very strong tradition of media education is sort of struggling, and primary schools, it's extremely uneven. And the overall kind of government policy about what's called here a knowledge curriculum, it's the E.D. Hirsch tradition, and the promotion of cultural capital using the kind of old Matthew Arnold definition of the best that's been said and done, promotes quite a narrow view of what the curriculum might be, let alone what might go into an arts curriculum. So there are some pretty big challenges. While there is an infrastructure and tradition and some strengths and lots of people interested, there are also big challenges. And I think one of the challenges relates to actually understanding what the outcomes of creative pedagogies and arts education actually are. And I conducted not a systematic review, because there were no randomised control trials or case control studies of the research that Creative Partnerships. For those of you that don't know, Creative Partnerships ran from 2003 to 2011. It touched 1 in 4 schools in the country. A number of schools actually had funding for the entire time of the program. It was the biggest creativity/arts education funding program in the world, and it put creative practitioners, predominantly artists, to work in schools to support the development of creative pedagogies with a view to changing the whole school itself. And CCE commissioned a lot of research, and I think the outcomes from that research, I think, are mixed. So there's really, I think, strong evidence around improvements in attendance, what we might call well-being, you know, homeschool relationships, what a lot of people call the kind of 21st century skills, which, you know, we might want to unpick. It's a term I'm not really comfortable with, but the kind of, you know, goal hot at the end of the rainbow of massive changes in learning outcomes, which are measured in this country through standardised tests and exams, didn't materialise, although some of the schools that had funding for a long time and that were in the kind of, there were 3 tiers in the program that were called National Schools of Creativity and Change Schools, did actually evidence quite significant changes in results, but it wasn't scaled up in the way that CCE might have hoped. So there's a kind of challenge, I think, in not only kind of unpicking what these things actually are, because we identified a lot of circuitous research in this kind of meta review. So you'd research parent relations and see that student voice was important, and you'd research student voice and you'd see that parent relations were important. So it, you know, there were some issues in the research itself which we identified, but there's a whole set of, I think, problems related to actually understanding what happens when we get into researching and trying to provide the convincing evidence for policymakers, particularly in the English context where the arts and creativity are not exactly flavour of the month anymore. The most recent work on creativity at something like a policy level, although this was not connected to government, it was connected through the Arts Council itself, I think, really, but not through kind of elected politicians, was the Durham Commission on Creativity, which reported at the end of last year and was kind of submerged by Brexit, really. And I think it hasn't had the kind of take up that the Commission might have hoped. But I want to draw attention really to one of the parts of the report, and there were a number of recommendations obviously from the report, and if you Google Durham Commission you'll be able to find the whole report and have a look at it. It does take up much the same kind of definition of creativity around something novel, something new, something that's got value. But I think for the first time we've started to have a bit of a look at what's the relationship between arts education and creativity. You know, creative partnerships, Paul Hamlin teacher learning program really fudge arts and creativity, and the assumption is that, you know, when artists work in schools, this is about creativity, and there are a lot of questions about that, I think, and I was very pleased to see, not without input from a number of people, including me, that they did take up this question. And, you know, they say, you know, creativity continues to be seen as the preserve of art subjects, and that's problematic. You know, obviously because creativity can come into a number of subjects, but this also actually doesn't help the arguments for a good quality arts education, which they suggest, and I think helpfully given the emphasis on the knowledge curriculum. They say the arts are not soft subjects. They offer a body of skills, knowledge and understands that generate a disciplined route to the acquisition of creativity. So this kind of intersection now, the challenge of outcomes and the intersection between the arts and creativity is where Chris and I have been kind of thinking for some time. And we had an opportunity to apply for some funding, which was made available by Arts Council England. And we formulated a project with two arts organisations with whom we had a very long-standing kind of research relationship, and we were all, the two organisations, the Royal Shakespeare Company and Tate, both have very extensive programs with teachers. The RSC also works with schools. And what we were interested in, we documented and, you know, written about the kinds of professional learning that teachers did when they worked with the RSC and with Tate. But what we really didn't know the answer to at all was what happens, you know, what do the kids get when their teachers take this learning back into schools? And I have to say, one of the things about the RSC and Tate is they don't provide lesson plans, or they don't tell teachers how to teach. They actually provide an arts-based experience, ongoing experience with teachers, and the teachers basically do the pedagogical work of thinking about what this experience actually means in a classroom, and so they do that kind of pedagogical interpretation and translation work. So we were interested in what that was and what it was that the students actually got from that work. So we formulated this, we got the funding. It's called the TAIL Project, Tracking Arts Learning and Engagement. So we're really looking, I think, at that kind of nexus that the Durham Commission identified about, you know, these are creative practices, but what does it actually mean? What are the in practice, and what are the students actually learning from it? And we wanted to work, it was a limitation to how much money we could get. We would have gone bigger than this, I think, if we could have applied for more money. But we wanted to do research at some scale. So we basically designed a study which had 3-year case studies of 30 schools, the multimodal kind of research, and significantly a survey of arts and cultural participation, which was modelled on a national survey called Taking Part, but we added in some additional questions because Taking Part has a rather elitist view of what arts and cultural participation is. So we added in a number of the kinds of activities that young people would more routinely do. So we were able to compare, there were enough items in common for us to be able to compare the survey of the students in the 30 schools with a national sample, and that actually turned out to be fairly important, as I'll show you in a minute. But one of the things I think that is probably important is that we've got responses from about 6,000 students, and that was both through the survey and through focus group interviews. We obviously did a lot of observation. We did interviews with teachers, 1 per year, and we've got quite a lot of photographic documentation documents as well. So, you know, the offices are full of piles of files and boxes of stuff that you have when you finish a big research project now, and we're still really, I think, going through it and trying to mine the best of it. So I think what I'm going to show you is really the top level kind of results. So the students said a lot of stuff about, you know, why they studied the arts. It was obviously a kind of question. We're working with students from year 10 to 13. They make a choice about whether they study the arts or not. The schools we were in, the 30 schools, 15 were nominated by Tate and 15 by the RSC. So they were a kind of purposeful sample, if you like. They were schools where the arts mattered, because we were interested in that question of the teachers' learning and how it was translated. So these were students that had had a pretty good arts experience in the early years of secondary school, and they had real choices to make in the senior secondary kind of curriculum. And so they told us that, you know, the kinds of things they told us focused partly on their understanding of what the arts were. They had, you know, lovely things to say about the arts, and the way in which they were, you know, not simply a kind of a subject that they studied. You know, you can see here actually a student quote saying their past, present and future. They talked about the nature of the arts education and what it was like, the kinds of pedagogies. You know, it wasn't a soft subject, it was hard. They you know, really had to work intellectually as well as learning kind of skills. But, you know, they loved it. It made life worthwhile in the school. They could cope with a lot of the rest of the curriculum if they were able to work in the art room or the drama room each day. They associated that with well-being, and even if they didn't want to continue with the arts, they thought that it was going to be a big part of their lives, you know. And kids routinely told us, you know, I'm going to be a mechanic, but I'm still going to maintain my YouTube channel. I'm going to be a doctor, but I can't imagine ever being a doctor without also continuing my arts practice. So that was important, an important insight, and we added that to what we saw in the survey. And I'm just going to quickly show you a little fraction of the survey. You can actually see the full survey results on our website, and the URL's on the last slide. The schools we were in were all over the country. We didn't want to do a kind of London-centric study, I mean, at least in part, you know, because I'm not in, and Chris and I are not in London. We share the rest of the country's hearty resentment of research projects and funding which are focused on London. So we were everywhere, really, around the country. So, but mostly in state schools. We only studied one independent school, and a couple of special schools were in the group as well. So what we got from the survey were things like this. School was important to a significant minority of the students in that they started their interest in the arts, and the school supported their ongoing interest in the arts. So what we were seeing was not entirely a group of students whose parents or they chose the school because of its arts kind of intensive focus, nor was it necessarily the case that these were homes where, you know, engaging in the arts was common practice. I mean, this is not the majority, but there's significant minorities, and that's important, I think, when we're talking about what schools do in relation to access to arts experiences. Young people in the survey students are the red line, and the other bars are different years of the taking part survey. And you can see that apart from going to art museums, where disappointing for tape, but the art museums, the participation in terms of going to things that the students in these schools engaged in is significantly higher. Actually, these are statistically significant differences between your ordinary English adolescent and those in these schools. And that continues when we actually look at what the kids were doing. So the kids in these schools, presumably, at least in part, we're looking here at school-produced effects because of the kinds of arts education that these young people had in the junior years. They just did a lot more stuff. They made films, they did craft, they played music, they sang in a band, you know, they read a book, they danced, they performed in a play. So there's a lot of interesting things here to think about in relation to what does this actually mean? If the kids are going to more stuff and doing more stuff, how do we understand that? Putting that together with what the young people told us, that this was something that was a kind of a lifetime activity. They were doing it now and they wanted to continue to do it. So here's how we now understand this. What we say is that the outcome of a good arts education is this: students who are appreciative, critical audiences and participants, and active, engaged producers. And we understand that now as these young people being cultural citizens. They were cultural citizens now in their schools and in their communities, and they were well prepared to be cultural citizens in the future, and they had that as an aspiration and an expectation that that's what was going to happen. And the big question, of course, then is, well, what did the schools actually do that produced this? So before I tell you that, I just need to do a tiny bit of definitional work, and I don't have time to do a lot of this. We've written some of this, we're still writing, but first of all, we understand, I mean, culture is often talked about in two dimensions, in an anthropological sense, but also in a narrower sense, where we're actually talking about cultural institutions like museums and galleries and arts and cultural practices. We've taken up the notion of cultural rights. Gerard Delanty talks about this as one of the most important dimensions of citizenships, and rights, cultural rights actually are the most underdeveloped in terms of theorising rights. So in terms, you know, economic rights, social rights, political rights are well established and debated within the literatures, but cultural rights are not, except in terms of representation of the diversity of the population in political activity. But we understand culture to be a process, cultural rights to be a process of being able to make sense of your world, your place in it, to join in a kind of public conversation, to have your stories heard and recognised. And we're drawing on work really from politics and sociology in order to expand our kind of understanding of what this means. Nick Stevenson actually works at Nottingham and is a colleague and does a lot of work in this area, and he talks about cultural citizenship as a practice which makes social life meaningful, allows for recognition of difference. Robert Kuttner, who's a US art educator, talks as well about artistic creation and consumption. So our kind of research findings fit with his way of understanding cultural citizenship. And here's Nick again saying that, you know, if you're going to, and this is of course against the kind of policy of a narrow understanding of a knowledge-based curriculum, talks about the importance of inclusion, which may involve revaluing cultural practices and narratives that more traditional forms of education have branded unworthy. And he talks here about a critical appreciation of artistic practices from classical music to performance art. He doesn't talk about production, which we see these as being kind of twin, inseparable actually, the kind of consumption and production. Arts policy tends to focus and tends to hold these things separate, and we think education is the site where these can come together. So we've got this little heuristic now, and I'm just going to race you through some of the key kind of issues here, and you can come back and have a look at this, but this is the way that we understand the production of, if you like, active cultural citizens, that kids don't come to school as empty vessels. They come with a lot of influences depending on who they are and where they are, but there are some key things that happen in classrooms, and this is about what the teachers do, what the schools do, and what the cultural organisations do. So I'm just quickly going to race through in my last few minutes just what these things are. So we're working with the notion of cultural school bags. I apologise to those of you if in your teacher education who've had to live with my virtual school bags for the last God knows how many years, but I'm still working with this idea that kids come to school with a whole lot, so can bring a whole lot of stuff with them, and that's the kind of what we've got to work with. We've got to be able to kind of share that. That's got to be the basis of the curriculum. It's not simply about connecting kids to what counts in whatever policy prevails. It's also about changing that through working with what there is. So this is a kind of starting premise that kids don't arrive cultural practice free, and what happens in the school, therefore, are pedagogies which are based in students' interests as well as curriculum framings that's then negotiated, that they're broadly kind of situated so they connect with society. They're not kind of narrowly focused. They're grounded in arts traditions. They use a lot of kind of dialogic process, a lot of reflective process. There are often very high stakes outcomes for students. They're sustained, they're ambitious, they're very challenging. That these are the kinds of pedagogies that we saw and have documented in the classrooms in which we were researching. So you get your school bags, you get these pedagogies, and then you get what we've called arts broker teachers. And these were the teachers that we had been working with, really, with in the RSC and in Tate, but when we worked with them in schools, what we could see is the way in which they brought all these outside practices, including their own arts practices, into the school, and the way in which they embodied what it meant to be a cultural citizen. And they very much wanted that for their students, and so they did lots of things differently depending on how well resourced the school was and where they were and what access they had, of course. But they worked really hard to actually open up that kind of cultural citizenship to the students with whom they worked, and we have written a paper about that. And the schools were also, the schools actively supported but also recruited arts broker teachers. Arts broker teachers tried to find arts-rich schools where they could work, and there was a kind of mutually beneficial relationship. The schools obviously saw themselves, their identity was very much around their kind of arts provision. They had a very rich web, strong web of relationships with artists and arts organisations. It wasn't just to take the RSC, there were loads of them. And the arts organisations like RSC and Tate, who were able to do so, offered what we've called immersive continuing professional development and learning, and there's a lot to say about that, and it's partly about being embedded in professional disciplinary knowledges, but it's also about the kind of haptic nature of what actually happened. They really are kind of embodied experiences that occur. And for those of you who are familiar with, you know, rehearsal room pedagogies, for example, and what it means to be involved in ensemble work, understand exactly what I'm talking about here. And there is, of course, a visual arts equivalent to that as well. And these are pedagogies which actually not only change what you do, but who you are and how you do it. And it's that kind of CPDL that was actually making a difference. So where we are at the end of this is we're saying that, you know, we don't just want to focus on arts education as a kind of learning outcome that can be measured in subject and test kind of results. That's clearly important, but what we're saying is the arts are more than a subject, they're for life, and that's where and that's almost, in fact, the title of the book that we're writing at the moment. It's called Cultural Citizenship, Arts Education for Life. So this is our kind of rejoinder to why would anybody study the arts. What we're doing next is we've got some funding from the Freelands Foundation for a primary school equivalent. That tail was secondary schools, and we are going to do a case control study of 40 primary schools, 20 arts rich and 20 not. And we're also doing a national survey of teacher education because particularly primary teacher education is one of the places where we need to get a lot more activity happening at the moment. So I think I've finished just about on time, and just to say that if you want to follow any of that up, we have got a couple of journal articles, some chapters, the reports are all available on our website, which is researchtailnet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was absolutely brilliant and so much relevance for what's happening in Australia as well. Those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat box. Professor Julie Dunn from Griffith University, would you like to lead off with your question, please?
Hi, Pat. Julie here. I'm sitting in the light. How are you going? Just thank you so much for that. It was amazing. Great summary of your wonderful work. But I'm wondering if you, being an Australian, can you talk about what the implications of the TAILS project might be in an Australian context where we suffer from those vast geographical distances which can limit access to cultural organisations for both teachers and students?
Yeah. Interestingly, there are some kind of parallels, I think, in England, although you don't necessarily expect them, but it can be pretty isolating in parts of the country, like up in the north in Cumbria or in Cornwall. One of the things that we saw, I have to say, and I didn't talk about really, but one of the things we saw in the study were schools that had become cultural hubs for the community. I mean, absolutely astonishing. They were drawing cultural resources to the school, but also to the community. So, you know, one of the schools that we worked with in Cornwall was really the kind of, well, just to give you an example, they decided that it would, because they couldn't get to the city, one of the things they wanted to do was to take advantage of the kind of simultaneous film screenings of productions in London from the kind of the big theatre companies, but they didn't have a film cinema they didn't have a cinema in the little village, so they literally just kind of set it up using pretty basic computing equipment that you'd have in a classroom, set it up in the school hall, and just let all the community come as well. And that became an extremely regular kind of thing, and they literally spawned a kind of cinema, as well as giving young people access to pretty high quality elite music and some popular music and theatre kind of productions. So I think thinking about, but I mean, you know, like it just took a huge amount of work. This is done on the back of, you know, committed teachers, the arts broker teachers who, you know, for whom it is their life and their passion. So there are some, you know, problems with that as well. But I think there are obvious issues in relation to isolation. But I think it is also thinking about, you know, in an ideal world, you know, as we once used to think in Australia about schools in rural and remote locations having community libraries. What would happen if you actually thought about this more generally? If you actually thought the major public infrastructure that's available now, you may not even have a bank, you know, but, you know, is actually the school. What can you do with a school, and how could we argue for a kind of cultural strategy that use schools as their hubs? I think would be my initial argument. I'm sure there's a lot of holes in that, but and I think it's quite difficult to bring some art forms through kind of technologically mediated means, but nevertheless, I think there are some possibilities that we could kind of think of as a basis.
Right, thank you so much.
Pat, I was wondering what the response has been, you know, from the TALE research, you know, from policymakers, etc. It's pretty powerful, and as you say, the student voice is, you know, really very convincing. But we all hope that we'll get our policymakers and bureaucrats to listen to this kind of research. Has there been a good response?
Well, no. I think there's been some interest from some people. I think Arts Council England have been interested in it. Mm-hmm. And because the England state school system is very devolved and now very fragmented, it's actually important to think not simply about kind of government policy, but actually the kinds of autonomies that schools have to make decisions. And so it is hard work, but I think actually working with some of the bigger kinds of education organisations. So we've got quite a close association with an organisation called ASCL, which is the Association of School and College Leaders, who are very committed to the arts. And in fact, Thomas Tallis, who's a lot of photographs from Thomas Tallis I was using, their head is on the kind of ASCL executive. I think that's a kind of helpful sort of alliance, and I think that's really what it is going to take. I don't think we're going to get anything from the politicians. In fact, the RSC and Tate, you know, they've got a lot of important people on their boards. They did work really hard, lobby really hard. I mean, yeah, we've had mentions in Parliament. We had a change in the way in which a particular elite group of universities counted art subjects for university entrance. Our research was quite significant in changing that. It wasn't the only thing that counted, but it was significant. Mm-hmm. But I don't hold out any great hope for this government at all, really. But, you know, the funder that we have now, Freelands, which is basically Liz Murdoch, is very ambitious about having big political clout. And we have designed this kind of next phase with the case control study and the national survey to allow her, she's on the Arts Council and, you know, a number of other bodies, to be able to continue the lobbying process. But I'm more interested actually working in schools. Sorry, went on too long.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's all very pertinent too to what's happening here. I'm not sure we're going to ever get this government to pay attention to the importance of the arts, and it's about our work in schools that does make a difference. Professor Liam Semler, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks very much, Robin. And thanks so much, Pat. I really loved listening to you then. It's just so fantastic hearing about all your work. I think it's yeah, really remarkable. My question might just be imponderable, I don't know, but it's just about the idea of there being two cultures, STEM, arts, the notion of STEAM, which is popular in schools. And just wondering what your thoughts are on this division about particularly in schools, and I think maybe particularly in high schools, just wondering if you feel this division is breaking down or evolving, you know, how kind of real it is. And obviously we have this government emphasis on the need for boosting STEM and tech going forwards, and that's not always coupled with boosting creativity in those spaces, and it's often, you know, presented as though the cash can be taken out of arts in order to fund the STEM boost. So yeah, just wondering your thoughts on that in Australia or in the UK. I'm just curious about where you feel that might be headed.
I have kind of mixed feelings about it. There is quite a lot of work happening around STEAM here. And there's some books coming out. There's been a kind of commission from the British Education Research Association. You can find the report online. In creative partnerships, interestingly, often the sciences were a place where creative work often happened. Science teachers actually were interested in the possibilities. I'm concerned about the possibility of, I guess, this being a way for arts processes to be used, as opposed to, I guess, to go back to that Durham Commission notion, the kind of drawing on the kind of, I guess, reducing the arts is what I'm into to a kind of set of creative processes is a concern. But I think it's actually, I think higher education could be quite helpful here, because I think we know more now about interdisciplinary work and what interdisciplinary work actually means. And I think we have to conceptualise this as an interdisciplinary area. So what actually happens when you bring these two disciplinary traditions together, and where do they actually speak to each other? And as I understand it, you know, science is actually curiosity driven. So I think to go back, you know, in a sense, to what's the foundation of science, you know, it is about curiosity. It is about understanding problems. It's got a lot of commonality with design, I think, actually, you know, rich kind of understanding of exploration of issues, a lot of generation of potential solutions, trialing them out, prototyping. You know, you have only to look at kind of the pandemic, I think, fantastic to see real science actually happening, you know, debates, differences, whatever. And a lot of it is, I think, quite, I could be put in terms of a creative process. So I think for me, it's that interdisciplinarity, and also perhaps learning from some of the examples where scientists and artists work together. And actually trying to understand that as an interdisciplinary process, and perhaps looking at some of the principles. and I suspect we work too much at the level of doing. I mean, it's a kind of personal analysis. It's unresearched, although it's based on some observation.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And one last question, Sarah Hawley.
Hi there, thank you so much, Pat. I'm from UCL in London, and I was just wondering, Bill Lucas's work with PISA in setting up an assessment framework and the tests that are going to take place, even though the UK's withdrawn, is there any chance that that could filter down from an international level and start influencing national governments, do you think?
Oh, I have no idea. The fact that governments have variously signed on to that, I think sort of indicates that, the global is not a kind of necessarily a top-down phenomena, and the nation states kind of take from the global when it's convenient. I find it difficult to imagine that this particular government, with its love of a kind of canonic approach to curriculum, I find it difficult to believe that they're going to be interested. Another government might. But I think there will be interest in schools. There is interest in schools, I think, and in collections of schools, in thinking about what this might mean. Bill's got a couple of new books out that he's talking at the moment, which are much more classroom based, I think, and talk about how it is that these kinds of habits of mind and dispositions can be put into practice in the classroom. And I think Thomas Tallis, for example, is a good case in point of a school that has actually taken their work on creative dispositions and put them into practice in a school. And I suspect that, that might be where Bill's interest is at the moment, given that he's just written these couple of books for schools.
Well, unfortunately, that's the end of our time tonight. But Pat, thank you so much for your presentation.